Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our next Simplify Consulting podcast. I'm Natasha Bridgewater, so I'm a wealth consultant here at Simplify. And this podcast is actually the very last instalment of our vulnerability campaign that we've been doing. And today we're going to be focusing and talking about managing and supporting vulnerability in the workplace. So today I am joined by our business manager here at Simplify, Matt Shaw. We've got Chloe Stuttard, Chief of Staff at LV, and we have Elspeth Sharp, Employment Support Services Manager at Salient Mind. So welcome everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just dive straight in. So I guess when we talk about vulnerability, as we all know, it's quite subjective. It's often transient and therefore can be quite complex. And I suppose if you then couple that with the kind of high staff turnover rates we do often see in operations, I suppose embedding that culture where vulnerability is understood and where it's supported could actually be quite challenging. So today we're just going to kind of explore if firms do enough for their own employees when it comes to vulnerability. And actually if having this internal focus, first of all, would almost lay the foundations for firms to be able to kind of better manage and support customer vulnerability. So Matt, so I'll come to you first of all. So I thought maybe perhaps you could just talk to us kind of about why it's important for firms to be able to identify and respond to the needs of their own employees and almost what benefits that would provide a firm.
Yeah, sure. So I think when we think about vulnerability, I guess, firstly, it shouldn't just be about customers. It should also be about our people, our colleagues. I think it's really important that firms have in place safeguards to both spot any vulnerabilities, but also to protect their staff where they exist. I think the number of people considered to be vulnerable may actually be higher than people think. I guess it also might change throughout someone's career as things happen in people's lives. So it's not just about establishing any vulnerabilities at the point at which someone perhaps joins an organisation. I think spotting it is the first step, but once you've established a vulnerability exists, it's then about businesses supporting that person in the most appropriate way for that individual. And that's probably not a one-size-fits-all approach. You need to flex it depending on what it is and the individual and how they want to be treated. But I think back to your point about the benefits, I think if firms don't spot when someone may be in a vulnerable position, then they risk treating them in a way that's not fair, and they may fail to take the opportunity to make some reasonable adjustments or provide additional support when it's really needed. So I think it's really important, not just, I think it's really important just as it is important when we're thinking about customers and vulnerability.
I suppose we could lose some good people as well, couldn't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think people, expect to be treated in a fair and reasonable way, and that will be different for everyone depending on their personal situation.
Yeah, thank you. And so Chloe, what's kind of your views of how firms can kind of practically enhance the employee experience and I guess really be on that front foot when it comes to identifying possible signs of vulnerability with their employees and dealing with them?
Thanks, Tash. I think it's a shift at the moment in culture of being reactive versus being proactive. And I think over the last several years, in my experience, firms got quite good at putting in place reactive supporting tools. So there have been, awareness has been better and there have been lots of initiatives going on, but a lot of it relied on somebody disclosing they were feeling vulnerable to you. And actually now we're on a journey of maturity and it's more about how do we be more proactive and how are we spotting those signs much earlier on before people are in a more crisis situation. And actually, I think everyone agrees that if we can do that, you are more able to help people before a situation is worse. There are lots of things that can be done to help support that. I don't think there is one tactical solution that I could possibly suggest. I think it would be wrong not to talk about culture, and that is the least tactical solution you can suggest, but it really is important. And as Matt said, having a culture where you are invested in the wellness of people and you want to understand people, that's customers and colleagues, is really important. And if you want your colleagues and your teams to be able to talk about when they're feeling vulnerable, you have to have a culture of openness. So I think top down sets a really good example about that. So story sharing, senior people from all around the organization talking about different situations in life, and they might not use the term vulnerability, but times when they felt more vulnerable. So we've had lots of people, for example, sharing stories about mental health, about grief, about being diagnosed with illnesses or supporting families through that, or even just really tough times at work, really stressful situations, and how to manage stress that is work-related stress as well. So I think absolutely culture, the right culture has to be there, or I think you could implement as many tactical initiatives as you want, and they won't land as successfully. I think we also need to have leaders particularly trained in this early spotting, as I said, rather than being reactive. Actually, what do signs of stress or signs of discomfort look like in different people? So being aware that that can look different in different people. Some people, when they are stressed or feeling a bit vulnerable, going through something at their life, might be very quiet and withdrawn. For somebody else, that might look like completely different behavior. And I think it's really important to train particularly managers and leaders to understand what that can look like and learn their teams, learn people. It's all about people behaviors and understanding. And then absolutely you can have the toolbox, of things like colleague employee assistant programs and signposting and webinars and toolkits and podcasts and things that we can support people with, and assistance programs. But I think there is much more to be done now about spotting the signs earlier on.
Yeah, that's really interesting as well, about sort of that top-down view and actually having people kind of at the top being able to be open and honest themselves as well, isn't it? Especially with like work stress, because I think sometimes with work stress, we all like to look like we're in control, we're coping, we're getting it done, but actually, like, just by being sort of open and saying, oh gosh, actually really struggling with this is a lot, and kind of doing that at all levels, surely that must make a huge difference and quite an impact to other people by just seeing that.
Absolutely. I think it takes that pressure off people to feel that they have to be perfect and they're not allowed to be vulnerable. The more people talk about their different situations, you can see, okay, it's not just me going through that, and it's okay, and you can still be successful and still get on with things. And actually, if you need some support, that's fine too. But I think it really, that open culture can't be underestimated.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Chloe. Really interesting. And so at Solent Mind, Elspeth, so you deal with kind of bringing clients into employment, maintaining employment, or even kind of moving roles to something that just might be a bit better fit for them. So I guess from your point of view, have you got any kind of good or poor examples of things that you've seen of employee support in the workplace? And have you got any kind of recommendations that you'd like to see firms implement?
Yes, so a couple of examples, sorry, of the many case studies that we have. These are two very, very recent ones. They're basically just two from people who were discharged in the last month or so. And there were very, very many to choose from, and there were a lot of very similar stories, but then, as Chloe was saying, everybody's different, so everybody has different needs. As much as we specifically help people with mental health issues, it's about the whole person, exactly as Chloe was saying again, and Matt's been saying, you need to look at the individuals. So there's not a one size fits all. Everybody gets personalised, individualised service from us and support from us. So the first example is somebody who had not been working for a few years, they had a really strong background in admin, but since the time they've been working before, everything had moved on in terms of technology, essentially, and that was essentially the only problem. You'd think the employer would know this from having read their CV, but they struggled and they didn't pass their probation. So the employer went straight into informal performance management, which then just made them feel singled out and made them feel, well, they were very upset by it and felt like they were being treated incredibly unfairly. So this was when they were referred to us, and the employment advisor who worked with this person got their union rep involved in some meetings, and then it changed into the probation being extended rather than it being a performance management issue, to give them a little bit more time to get on top of the job. But the job was very fast paced, and they just couldn't keep up, and they weren't getting additional training. It was just a case of, we'll give you a little bit more time to get your head around this. So ultimately they left the job. And our employment advisor, they don't necessarily always get somebody a new job or help them get a new job if that's not what they need. And this person just needed training. They needed a massive confidence boost in terms of doing anything online, anything technical, anything to do with IT. They just felt so kind of battered by their experience at this place, where they've been so excited to get back to work. So did some work in the library with them, and Hive are based at the library, and they gave them a lot of help with the IT side of things. So their CV got polished up beautifully, and online job searches and so on. Hive are based there all the time. So as much as they have the appointments with the employment advisors from us, they can just pop in there anytime. And then they were encouraged to take one of our IT skills courses at Solar Mind. And it's a safe space, and that's what they needed, was a safe space to be able to just feel vulnerable, basically. And now they're actually pursuing that. They've decided actually they're going to brush up their skills a little bit more, IT skills, and they're doing some math skills as well before they actually step back into work. So there's an example of an employer not dealing with what was in front of them, taking on somebody who hadn't worked for several years and not taking into account that might mean they weren't quite up to date with the technology at hand, and not providing any training, and then they've ended up having to leave because it was too stressful. Another one which got a bit of a happier ending. I mean, that's a happy ending. They're getting their skills, and they'll find somewhere which is much more suited to them. So another person was working at a utilities company. So it's a depot. It's noisy. It's busy. They have additional physical needs as well. So they had fibromyalgia and a hearing impairment, which made it very difficult for them to work in the depot. So there had been a reasonable adjustment put in place for them to work from home. That was kind of under threat because after COVID, obviously a lot of employers are desperate to get everybody back in the office, even though it might actually suit the individuals better to be working from home. And it's certainly cheaper for people to work from home for a lot of employers. So there was the fear of that. They already had a very fast-paced role, very tight deadlines. They got on well with people they worked with, but quite often people would be pulled out of teams and put into a different project to cover somebody up. There was a lot of covering going on, and that's what happened to them. Is that one of their colleagues was on leave for 3 weeks, and they were just told to do their job as well as their own for 3 weeks. And it was they did get some support from their line manager in that, but it just wasn't possible. And it was so stressful, they ended up taking 4 weeks off, or being signed off for 4 weeks for stress. So this is where our employment advisor got involved, and they sat down and did a stress risk assessment with them. Occupational health were very, very helpful and gave the right recommendations in the end, which was essentially to continue working from home and have a phased return to work rather than just bam straight back into the noisy depot. And another thing that the employment advisor did from our side was to encourage them they had a look at all the staff networks available so that they could get involved in ones that would actually be having an impact on the culture, changing the culture, and they'd be able to contribute their ideas. and actually be heard. So that one's worked out very happily within the same organisation.
That's good.
I suppose the first one. But there's some very simple things that people can do, and I think is exactly what Chloe was saying, is just that openness in the first place, being open to listening. And a very good way of doing that is not by, rattling on about yourself, obviously, but just admitting that you're human and fallible, no matter how senior you are. And it just creates a degree of openness that isn't there otherwise. Being less directive in terms of management. There's a time and a place for directive management, but most of the time that's not the best way of doing things. It needs to be collaborative. And I think it's, again, as you've been saying, there's a shift in culture these days where it's not a case of weakness. If you have things going on outside of work and you happen to bring them into work, it's perfectly acceptable to have a bad day. It's perfectly acceptable to have things going on externally to work that are having an impact on your work. And that's not a negative thing. If you can be supported, then it means you don't lose your employees on those days. You're not just throwing money into the wind because people can't cope with coming into work because they don't think you're going to listen to them. They don't think you're going to understand. They might need a little bit of an adjustment, even if it's just that one day. Reasonable adjustments aside, from a legal stance. So, and of course, the flip side is that you can have a much healthier life mentally and probably physically. Well, everything impacts everything else. But if you're in work and you actually feel that you have a purpose, and that's what we find with a lot of our services, especially that first example, somebody who's been out of work for a few years, you can end up drifting and not really feeling like you're actually contributing to anything and not much use to anybody. Whereas if you have work and a purpose and a focus, it helps in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, thank you. That's and I suppose it's touching on kind of the first example. It's almost firms not being so rigid in their expectations as well, and actually being able to be a bit flexible and more responsive. I think that kind of reminds me of a occurrence I had in a previous job role where someone came in to start one of the teams, and it was more of a sort of it was like a call taking function, kind of really a different role for them and not something they were used to at all, and they kind of really struggled with the initial training phase. I think it was just because it was a very uncomfortable role for them and probably not within their skill set, but actually we were able to reposition them into a different role, and I think they stayed there for probably like 5 or 6 years, which was, that was the flexibility and be able to listen and understand. So that's really interesting. Thank you. Chloe, coming back to yourself, so what downstream impacts do you think this could have for firms and for the customer journey, particularly those who are deemed as vulnerable? If firms can kind of make these changes, improve that culture of openness, being more flexible and listening, what's the impact, do you think, to kind of firms and customers?
I think there's absolutely an intrinsic link between colleague experience and colleague engagement and what you can deliver to customers. And there's lots of research that's happened on that over the years. You get the benefit of retaining staff. So you have, staff that are more motivated, they have more knowledge, they're performing better at work. And that obviously helps you support customers. But I think particularly on the vulnerability side of things that we've been talking about, everything we've been talking about on this podcast now, it just is exactly the same as the conversations we've been having in the industry about how you support your vulnerable customers. And I think looking at them together can only be beneficial. We've talked about things like culture, openness, being trained to spot signs of stress or vulnerability, knowing how to approach conversations of whether somebody might need some more support or has any additional needs, and embracing those conversations without judgment, with the right level of empathy, all of that stuff. And then not being rigid. You just use the word rigid, which I think is a really good term, not being rigid in your response to that when somebody does share something. all of that applies completely to colleagues and their experiences as it does to customers, and when we're trying to support customers with vulnerabilities as well. So I think the more you can embed that, generally it's not one or the other. So yes, there will always be benefits of having, you know, a happy and motivated team of people, and that does transpire through to customer benefits. But on vulnerability, I think if you can get those key skills and that culture in place, that will only be good for both. You know, that will absolutely benefit colleagues as well as customers.
Yeah, and I suppose it's actually maybe firms just thinking about their people, internal and external, isn't it?
Yeah, all of this is just talking about people, isn't it? It's understanding people, it's being caring and wanting to be supportive in the right way to people, regardless of whether that's a customer or somebody, a colleague who is working with you. I think the other thing, we should pay attention to the well-being of our colleagues who are consistently dealing with customers who are in vulnerable situations. So for example, if there are teams in place that are specialized to deal with vulnerable customer escalations, you know, so they're dealing with customers who are in you know, more extreme situations, or they're having telephone calls that can be much more challenging, people who work on bereavement claims, you know, dealing with critical illness claims, things like that, that can be really hard conversations to have. And I think we need to pay particular focus, if there are specialist teams in place, on the well-being of those colleagues, because having those conversations day in, day out can be quite hard. It can also be quite triggering for people if they're going through something in their own lives. So I think it's really important in any of those specialist teams, if firms have an existing, that you know, you make sure those colleagues are equipped to help customers, but also their own resilience, and you're having those conversations in case they are stressed, you know, need any support as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, even if it's just a check-in at the end of the day. How did you get on? Were your calls okay? Any sort of bad cases or anything like that?
Absolutely, you know, having that time to decompress afterwards, having the option of having break after a call if it's been particularly difficult or particularly you know, taxing, you know, being able to just step outside for a breather for 5 minutes can often be what you need, or just a quick chat to your manager to decompress. It can be really helpful.
Yeah, good. Yeah, interesting. Thank you, Chloe. I guess, kind of, Matt, we've been kind of really thinking about this a bit more at Simplify, haven't we? In terms of looking after our own people, you know, considering what else we can do to support them. Could you just share a little bit about what we've been doing?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so you're right. I think, you know, we do quite a lot of this with our clients, focusing on the customer, and I think we certainly recognise that we've got to apply the same kind of internal focus as what we're recommending to our clients. And I think, firstly, just going back to culture, I think the kind of first part of this was Kate and Carl, our directors, kind of coming out and kind of saying to people, actually recognizing that this is a thing. It's something that we need to be aware of. It's okay to have, as we've touched on earlier, it's okay to be in some of these situations where you may need some more help. It's not going to be held against you. Actually, we want to recognize it so that we can provide help and support. So I think from that culture perspective, I think it's important that, you know, you've got people right at the top coming out and saying that, not just putting policies and procedures in place, but actually kind of talking to people and saying, look, actually, we're actively encouraging people to look out for signs of things that, you know, suggest people might need some additional help. I think beyond that, we've changed our onboarding process to ensure that we're talking to new members of staff at the outset to see if there may be any types of vulnerability that we need to be aware of, so that we can, you know, talk to line managers and make sure we're making reasonable adjustments at the outset. We recently did a team meeting specifically to raise awareness, letting people know again that it's okay to talk about this type of thing, and providing that reassurance, I think, which is important, that, you know, it can be kept completely confidential if that's what they're worried about, and kind of reassuring them that we're going to support them in a way that's kind of suitable and how they want to be kind of helped. We've also set up a dedicated page on our SharePoint site with kind of things to look out for if people are concerned about a colleague, or where individuals themselves feel they need help but perhaps don't feel comfortable talking to their line manager or the business support team. So we've kind of highlighted other confidential options that are available to them, both internally and externally. So I guess we've kind of really focused on 3 key areas: so education, reassurance, and highlighting the support that's available to everyone, whether that's within Simplify or externally.
Great, thank you, Matt. Well, actually, that kind of concludes our podcast today, and concludes our vulnerability campaign. So yeah, so just thank you very much to our panelists. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I hope everyone listening has found it insightful as well. If anyone would like to check out the rest of the campaign content, then just visit us at simplifyconsulting.co.uk, and hopefully we will see you all again soon.